I'm just talking about we are currently live on Facebook where our in-house dietitian is there to tell. Why don't you log in and ask there any questions you have around the like after put a hand. Okay, yeah.
Morning. This is our first Celiac Society live Facebook chat. So if anybody has any questions over the next 30 to 40 minutes, let us know. You can email us in, you can log on onto Facebook. And I'm going to start off with some of the questions because we've been asking members to send them in to us now over the last few days. So I'm going to start with those, and if anybody's any questions as we go, let me know. So the first one that turns up a lot is, how do you stay healthy on a gluten-free diet? So there's a few things that we do need to look at. When someone is celiac and we take the gluten out of the diet, that's going to help solve a lot of the issues. But we know that people with celiac disease can run into problems with a couple of other nutrients. So vitamin D becomes a really important one, and we generally recommend that people with celiac disease are taking a supplement of vitamin D of about 10 micrograms a day. The weather in Ireland means that a lot of us are just not getting enough vitamin D from sunshine, but we have problems then absorbing it if we are celiac. Even on the gluten-free diet, it can still have an impact, so it is one to take a look at. B vitamins can also be an issue. So lots of people with celiac disease can run into problems with vitamin B12 and with folate. So very important to have foods that are rich in B12, which are things like milk, fish, eggs, chicken and meat are all really, really good places to get it. And then folate or folic acid is another excellent one to keep an eye on. So green leafy vegetables would be a good source of that. One of the other questions that we've had actually from several people is talking about gluten-free products being very high in sugar and fat. And certainly a lot of people with celiac disease, once they're diagnosed, can gain quite a bit of weight. And it is not unusual for people to put on substantial weight in the first year after they are diagnosed. And this is one of the reasons why people, when they're diagnosed with celiac disease, do need to see a dietitian at the start, but also to be checked up again maybe in 6 months to a year, just to see what the weight is doing and if there's anything that they do need to have a look at. It's not that gluten-free foods are particularly high in sugar and fat compared to others. Some of them will have a little bit more for sure, because when you take the gluten out, it's a little bit difficult to get all of the different sort of textures back into the bread. So often other ingredients are added to sort of make up for it. The main reason why most people will gain weight on a gluten-free diet is that if they've been celiac for several years, they probably weren't absorbing some or a good chunk of the food that they were eating. So they were eating a certain amount of food which wasn't being absorbed. And then when they go gluten-free, they are now absorbing all of their food, but they're still eating the same amount. So there will be a little bit of weight gain for a lot of people with that. So very often when I'm working in the clinic here at the Celiac Society, one of the things that we do talk about are portion sizes. And that for a lot of people, they might need to reduce their portion sizes once they are diagnosed with celiac. And a good way to look at that is just to really pay attention in the first few months to, you know, how full you are feeling when you're eating. A lot of people, particularly when we work with children, say they're very hungry all the time or they're trying to eat a lot of food. Once they're diagnosed and they're on the gluten-free diet and the gut is healing and they're absorbing food again, often they can find that they don't need as much food. So they might find actually towards the end of the meal they're quite full. But sometimes we're all brought up to clear the plate, so you might not always need to do that. And really particularly snacks in between meals, to have a good think about whether or not I'm hungry for them or am I still just having them out of habit. And again, if you go back to your dietitian, if you find that you are gaining a good bit of weight with this, it's definitely worth going back to your core registered dietitian and just having a look and see what you need to get from there. One question that comes up actually very often for us is where sometimes people will see barley listed as an ingredient on some food products that are listed in our food list. So the celiac food list, this is a list of all the foods that don't have any gluten ingredients, but have also been checked to have any gluten contamination. So with the Celiac Society, every year we spend a substantial amount of our time contacting food companies and checking their process, checking what's on the lines, checking the ingredients. And foods that are gluten-free will come into our book. And the criteria for being gluten-free means that a food has less than 20 milligrams of gluten per kilogram of the food, which is about 20 parts per million. And what you will sometimes see is barley might be listed as an ingredient on the label, but if it's there in very, very tiny amounts, so if it's less than the 20 parts per million, it's too small, that the amount of gluten in that is too small to be having a reaction, and that's why it will be gluten-free. And often where you might see that is maybe on a food that has several parts to it, and maybe there's like chicken and there's a sauce on it, and there's maybe something like a little bit of Worcestershire sauce in it that would have tiny amounts of barley, but it wouldn't be enough to cause a reaction. So it's really about sort of just checking the labels. If you're not sure, if you're a member, absolutely ring the Celiac Society and check, and we can certainly double check anything for you and come back to us. One member has just contacted us. She said, I'm currently getting investigated for celiac disease at the minute, and if I eat gluten and my bowel reacts as in blood, is this a sign? Well, certainly, definitely if you're having any blood coming out of the bowel, you really do need to go and see your GP very quickly. So investigate for celiac disease. Blood can be a sign. Sometimes it's a sign that there's something else going on. You might get blood if you have problems like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis, and that's why you do need to get properly, fully investigated. Very often when we see people who are being tested for celiac disease, they just have a blood test. And what most people don't realize is that the blood test for celiac disease is like a screening test. It's not diagnostic in most cases. So if you have a blood test, you do need to go and have a biopsy as well. And the reason you need to have the biopsy is to make sure that it is actually celiac disease and that it's not something like Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis that will need a different treatment. So that's where you might get some blood. You might sometimes see people having things like mucus and other bowel upsets with it. But that's why you need to get fully investigated when it comes to celiac disease with both the blood test and as well as that going to get the biopsy for it. Mags has just contacted us to say she had a severe gluten reaction last Thursday, still in a brain fog and feeling flu. Is there any advice to help heal the body? This is a question we get all the time. No, there isn't any particular thing except to wait it out, unfortunately. It's really about letting the gluten just pass through the system, and the damage that's been done to the gut. And, if we talk about brain fog, obviously we know that gluten can have an impact on the nerves as well. A lot of it is to hydrate. If you find that a lot of people would have severe vomiting and diarrhea with it, so key thing is to keep hydrated, plenty of fluids coming in. You might need to have a look at electrolytes as well. And these would be things like sodium and potassium, and we can lose a lot of that if you do have severe vomiting and diarrhea when you have a gluten reaction. So a little bit of well-diluted orange juice can be quite good. There's a nice rehydration solution that you can use where you would take about a pint of water and add a good dollop of orange juice into it, because that will give you some great potassium, pinch of salt. It sounds strange, but it actually works very well, and that brings in the sodium and the potassium and the fluids, and that's a great drink to take. It's not going to win any awards for taste, but it's a lovely way if you're, just to get some of your fluids back in again as well. Someone's asking that they're celiac and they're lactose intolerant, and does this pass? So one thing we do see a lot is a lot of people, when they're very newly diagnosed, can react to lactose as well as to the gluten. And what's happening here is that the part of the digestive system that deals with lactose can be quite severely damaged in people who are celiac. But when they take the gluten out of the diet, this will gradually grow back. And most people who are lactose intolerant at the start with celiac disease can go back to taking milk. Usually it takes a different time for different people. We would usually trial it again in about 6 months. And if that's not working, you might try again in a year. For some people, it can take up to 2 years for the gut to fully heal once they go on the gluten-free diet. So it's worth just doing a little challenge every so often with some milk, and just see if you're still getting any bloating or tummy reactions with that. Very important if you are lactose intolerant to make sure that you are getting plenty of calcium in from other foods. There's lactose-free milk available now, which most people can use, and that's fantastic. Cheese actually has very little lactose, so most people who are lactose intolerant can eat cheddar cheese, which is a really good source of calcium. And then yogurt is a good source of calcium. Some people with lactose intolerant can manage a little bit of yogurt. Some people might need to use lactase enzymes with that, but certainly lactose-free milk and hard cheese are good. If you want to use some of the plant-based milk alternatives, things like soy milk or almond milk that have calcium added can be helpful, but do check the labels. It's really important to make sure that calcium has been added to those, otherwise the levels might not be what you need to get. Green vegetables will give you some calcium, but it's actually quite difficult to eat enough regularly to get the amounts. A lot of patients would talk to me about broccoli for calcium, but you'd want to be eating a substantial amount of broccoli, 10 to 16 servings a day, to get calcium. So certainly include green vegetables, but make sure you're getting good sources of calcium from other places. If you are struggling to get your calcium in, it's definitely worth thinking about a calcium supplement. What we do find is a lot of people, even if they can take dairy, struggle to get sort of the 3 to 4 servings of dairy in a day that people need to get their calcium. And that's where a supplement can be useful. And again, if you have a chat with your dietitian and just check out what you need to do with that. As you mentioned earlier, your vitamin D supplement is really important. This is going to help you to absorb any of the calcium that you actually eat. In Ireland, we have, we're looking at the rain out the window while I'm sitting here, and we're just not getting enough sunshine. Foods that are good sources of vitamin D would be oily fish like tuna, salmon, mackerel, good places to get it. Eggs would have some, but again, very few of us are eating enough to get it. And certainly for people with celiac disease, we do recommend a vitamin D supplement of 10 micrograms a day. Someone's just asking, is the biopsy the only full way? So we talked a little bit about that a few minutes ago, that we do need to have the biopsy done. And so this is where we do need to go and have the endoscope, which is the camera going down. And that's going to take 4 different tiny pieces out of your gut, and it's going to check to see what the gut looks like and see if it looks like a celiac gut. If it doesn't, then obviously you need to have more tests. And that's why if you do think that you have any tummy symptoms or you have anything going on, it's really important to check in with your GP and make sure that you're diagnosing it properly, because we see people who, for example, say they have irritable bowel and they're trying to do different things with it for years, and it turns out they're actually celiac because they've never gone to the GP, or they think they're celiac and they cut out the gluten, and actually it's other problems instead. So it's really important, if you're having, bloating, diarrhea, constipation, gut problems, definitely check in with your GP, look at a celiac test if you need it, and get properly diagnosed. One of the most important things to remember when you're going through testing for celiac disease is to make sure you continue to eat gluten the whole time. Sometimes people will say, well, I thought I was celiac, so I cut out the gluten to check and I felt better, but then when I got tested, the test came back negative. If you cut out gluten, the tests will come back negative. It's incredibly important to keep eating gluten the whole time. So if you go into your GP, you have your blood test, your screen. Even if that's positive, you need to continue eating gluten until you've had your biopsy done. And this is why we do need to try and get the biopsy done as soon as possible after the blood test, so people aren't hanging around for weeks or months trying to eat the gluten-free diet. If you have gone off gluten, you need to be eating gluten for around 4 to 6 weeks before you have your test. And you need to be getting some gluten in at 2 to 3 meals a day. So adding in some bread, cereals that are based on wheat, having pasta, things like that. If you're having a very severe reaction, it is worth going to the gastroenterologist and talking to them about the fact that you've been off gluten, because they need to know that before they test you. And it's to have a conversation there. Certainly with some children who are celiac, if they have a very, very high level on their blood test, they may not need to have a biopsy done. Most children still will. But again, that's a conversation to have with the child's gastroenterologist, and just to get a referral in there to check that out. Question here about dermatitis herpetiformis, and dermatitis herpetiformis is a wonderful name for a skin rash that is caused by celiac disease as well. And you can have the skin rash and maybe not have any digestive problems, or you can have both. Dermatitis herpetiformis is a very, very itchy skin rash, and it can occur in any place on the body. It most commonly will affect elbows, knees, around the buttocks, and it tends to be on both sides of the body. So you'd rarely have it in one elbow, you generally would have it in both. But the dermatitis herpetiformis can turn up on face, neck, hands, it can be anywhere. And it is part of the manifestation really of celiac disease. So if someone has this, they need to go to a dermatologist and get checked. But also, if they are diagnosed with dermatitis herpetiformis, they do need to have the biopsy done to have a look at the gut. The treatment for dermatitis herpetiformis exactly the same as for celiac disease. They really are more or less the same thing, and it is a strict gluten-free diet for life. Although most people from a gut point of view will start to feel well fairly quickly, within a couple of days even of starting a gluten-free diet, from a skin point of view, that can take quite a while. It might take up to a year. Now, what we do know is that people who go on the gluten-free diet, who have seen a dietitian and have had really good detailed advice, it seems to resolve a little bit faster. And it's just that although we can sort of, when it comes to sort of being gluten-free, a lot of us know that it's in bread or pasta. Where I find a lot of people are missing out is the cross-contamination, being unaware of all the little places where you pick it up. And as I said, quite a tiny amount of gluten will have an impact. So we, for example, would see huge numbers of people who have no idea that there's gluten in chips in most restaurants, unless they have a separate fryer, because if they fried, deep fried fish in the oil, there's now enough gluten in the oil, unfortunately, to get onto the chips, and the chips aren't gluten-free. So people often don't realize all the small places where they're picking up gluten, but that can still be having an impact. And it will delay the gut healing, and it will delay the skin healing as well. So osteoporosis, so we've a few questions around looking after bone and bone health, and this is one of the biggest sort of side effects of celiac disease is osteoporosis. Now, osteoporosis is a brittle bone disease where the bones break more easily if you fall or you bump into something, and it's very common in Ireland anyway. So in Ireland, 1 in 4 men in Ireland over 55 will break a bone due to osteoporosis. Now that jumps to 1 in 2 women, so it's quite a lot of us who would break maybe wrist, hip, but also it can cause big damage to the spine. People with celiac disease are even more likely to develop osteoporosis compared to the general population. And that's why it's one of the tests that we would look at, is that we check for things like vitamin D, and that people would look at getting a bone scan to check that their bone levels are very good. And often one of the reasons someone is diagnosed with celiac disease is that they developed osteoporosis at a much earlier age. So someone who easily broke a bone, we would certainly know of one person who had a football thrown at them by a child and it broke their sternum, and it turned out they had severe osteoporosis even though they were only in their late 30s, and that led on to a diagnosis of celiac disease. That's the extreme end of things, but it is one to be really careful about. And with osteoporosis, there's a couple of nutrients we need to keep an eye on. The first and most important thing is to be on the strict gluten-free diet. So it is avoiding all gluten all the time, so that whatever nutrition we eat is coming into the body. And then we need to have plenty of calcium coming in. So 3 to 4 servings of dairy-rich foods a day, and the vitamin D is important. But we also need to remember exercise, that we, in the same way that we build muscle when we exercise, we also build bone. So we're great walkers. We tend to do a good bit of walking in Ireland, and that carries weight on the hips, especially if you're going brisk walking. And if you're into running, that's fabulous as well. But then we need to look at exercises for the spine and for the wrists, because wrist fractures are a common fracture in people with osteoporosis. So you might need to do things like lifting weights. You might go to the gym a little bit. Exercises like yoga or Pilates, where you would carry a good bit of weight on your wrists, and that would actually support through the spine as well. So it's important to think of upper body exercise as well as kind of legs. Swimming, although it is fantastic for muscles, because it's not weight bearing, it's not going to have a benefit for your bones. Now, it's a brilliant benefit elsewhere in the body, but if you are a swimmer, it's worth adding in something like Pilates, some weights, other exercises that are going to help to build the bones there as well. We have a question here about constipation. A lot of people, actually this comes up so much, a lot of people when they're celiac, they've had obviously the opposite problem. Not everybody, but quite a few people would have had sort of loose bowels, a little bit of hurry for a while, and then when they go on the gluten-free diet, things can slow down quite a bit. Why does that happen? So a lot of people can run into constipation. Now, I know certainly some people, they've been so used maybe their whole lives to things being very loose that we often have to have a bit of a conversation around the fact that actually you've just gone to what's normal. So at the risk of being a little bit disgusting, so what's normal? So normal healthy bowel movements are you're going once or twice a day. It should be coming out easily, you shouldn't be struggling, and it should look like a cracked sausage or a smooth banana. So that's kind of what you're aiming for. If you're finding things are a little loose or fluffy, or certainly if they're heading into liquid, there's a problem. But even on the other hand, if you find that what you're producing is very hard, is very difficult to move, then we have constipation and we need to have a look at that. And one of the problems that we see a lot is that very often when people go on a gluten-free diet, their fibre levels go down quite a bit. And that's because a lot of us would get our fibre from high fibre breakfast cereals, and quite a few of them we can't have anymore once we become celiac. So it's really important to get the fibre in. So if you are able to take oats, and 95% of people who are celiac can eat oats, just make sure you have the certified gluten-free oats. They're going to give you some fibre. Great thing to do there is add in things like seeds. So if you look at things like linseed, flaxseed, they are fantastic for fibre. If you're using them, just make sure that they are split or cracked. There's a kind of a gel inside them, and you really want that to come out, and that's what's really going to help keep things nice and soft and moving. So if you look at linseeds or flax seeds, just read the label, make sure they're split or cracked, or that they have been crushed or in some way, and you can buy them already ground up and they're ready to go. So, but all kinds of seeds work. If you like sunflower seeds, sesame, pumpkin, they're all going to be really high in fibre. So it's great to start adding 1 to 2 dessert spoons into porridge in the morning. They will go really well into yogurt. Some people put them over salads. If you're making your own bread, you can put them into that. So there's lots of different ways to add them, and they'll add quite a bit of fibre. And then you need to look at things like fruit and vegetables. The main problem with it is that a lot of us think there's more fibre in food than there actually is. So you do need to be aiming to get around 25 grams of fibre in every day if you're going to get the digestion to work properly. So if we eat fruit or vegetables, they vary a bit, but you're really looking at 2 to 3 grams of fibre for most of them. And you need 25 a day, 25 grams of fibre, not 25 pieces of fruit. But if we want to, we talk a lot about having 5 to 7 servings of fruit and veg a day. If you're doing that, you'll kind of get up to 10 or 12 grams of fibre from that. And then again, that's where adding in your seeds, you might add 3 to 6 grams of fibre there. If you are choosing bread, even go for the whole grain versions or the higher fibre varieties of gluten-free bread. And if you look at the label, a food that's high in fibre will have 6 grams of fibre per 100 grams. And so if you can see that, or if that's higher, and some of the gluten-free breads are, so that's one place where you can add an extra little bit of fibre. Beans and lentils are fantastic for fibre, and they're really good foods to add. So things like chickpeas, kidney beans, putting lentils if you're cooking soups or stews. Again, you're just checking labels. They are naturally gluten-free, but it's just having a look in terms of cross-contamination or checking your food list to make sure that they're all okay. And then looking at things like if you're having pasta, again, look for the higher fibre options with pasta. And it's really worth getting into the habit of thinking about high fibre foods at every meal. So, and a good rule of thumb is to make sure that fruit or vegetables is making up about 1/3 of each meal. So if you look at breakfast in the morning, 1/3 of your breakfast should be fruit. Look at your lunch, a third of that vegetables or salad. So if you're normally having a roll or a sandwich or something like that at lunchtime, you might need to add a bowl of vegetable soup or add a side salad in there in terms of getting the vegetables in. And then again at dinner, when you look at your plate for dinner, at least a third of what goes on the plate needs to be salad or veg. So if you can kind of think in that way, that's going to get plenty of fibre in. One of the other things to think about with fibre, though, is that you're drinking plenty of fluid. Fibre works by soaking up a lot of liquid, and that's, you know, if you cook porridge, the way it soaks up all the liquid. So you want fibre to do that inside your bowel, so everything is very soft and very easy for the muscles of your bowel to move. So when you're increasing your fibre, especially when you're increasing linseed or flaxseed, plenty of fluid with that. Now, you don't need to be drowning in it. 1.5 to 2 litres of water a day will be plenty. And that can include things like herbal tea, milk, a small glass of fruit juice. So about 150 mils of fruit juice is fine. Don't really want to have more than that, but that would give you a little bit of extra fluid through the day with it. Some people benefit from using a probiotic, and some that can be quite helpful for digestive system. Probiotics can work in different ways. So again, it's worth talking to your dietitian and just seeing which would be the best one for you to use if you're struggling with the constipation. Another question that we have in is around pregnancy and fertility. So I'm not celiac, but I've been trying to get pregnant for 3 years, and I've read that celiac disease can be a cause. So do I need to get tested, and where do I go? So we do know that women with undiagnosed celiac disease can struggle to become pregnant. They are also substantially more likely to have a miscarriage, to have sort of spontaneous abortion, and they're also more likely to have a stillbirth. So even if they do go through the full pregnancy, it's a little more common for someone to have a stillbirth if they are undiagnosed celiac. So once you are diagnosed celiac and you're on a gluten-free diet, risks around fertility are exactly the same for everybody else. So we would certainly see lots of our members were diagnosed when they were going through fertility treatment and they weren't getting anywhere with it. So what do we need to do? So testing is the same. It's to continue eating gluten, go to your GP, talk to the GP about having the celiac antibodies tested, and your GP can do that for you. If they come back positive, continue to eat your gluten, but then to go and have the biopsy done and check if it's celiac disease. What we would see, and certainly thinking of a couple of people we've worked with in the last while for fertility, they didn't realize that it wasn't normal to be having diarrhea twice a week. And if you have people who've been doing that all their lives, it just doesn't register as being normal or as being abnormal because they've just done it. And what we would see for a lot of people who would say they had no symptoms of celiac disease, once they were diagnosed, they realized, oh, I'm not bloated anymore, I'm not having stomach cramps anymore, I'm not having diarrhea twice a week. So they were having symptoms all the time, but just not really recognizing them. So from a fertility point of view, going the strict gluten-free diet. So again, sitting down with your dietitian, getting really good advice on gluten-free diet, but also looking at some of the key nutrients, because your B12 is going to be important, but selenium and zinc are also very important for pregnancy as well. But the crucial thing is get tested before you cut out the gluten. It's important to get properly, fully diagnosed, because someone who might be gluten intolerant can take a little bit of gluten and it's not going to cause a problem. But if you are celiac, even tiny amounts will cause a problem, even if you don't feel it. It's worth remembering that about half of people with celiac disease don't feel anything if they eat gluten, but all of the damage is still going on the inside. And this is particularly true from a fertility point of view. So it's important to see, are you fully celiac, that you need to be very, very strict on the gluten for that. Another question just come in. I've been celiac for nearly 10 years. I'm very careful about my diet. My hair is falling out recently. Do I need to add a supplement? My energy levels are down too, so I think I might need to take a tonic. That's an interesting one. A lot of people with celiac disease are more likely to develop underactive thyroid. So I would certainly check this out. So some of the signs of underactive thyroid is that your hair is falling out, energy levels being low, certainly more constipation, very dry skin, and sometimes your voice will get hoarse. Some people will gain weight, most people will gain weight, not everybody does. But certainly if you're seeing hair falling out, energy levels down, and nothing seems to be working, it's definitely worth popping into the GP and having thyroid checked. And it's something we recommend for people with celiac disease. Every so often, it's no harm to get thyroid levels checked. The same genetic setup that will lead to celiac celiac disease, the same genes actually lead to type 1 diabetes and underactive thyroid. So someone with type 1 diabetes is more likely to get celiac disease. Someone with celiac disease is more likely to develop type 1 diabetes. Now, definitely not type 2. They're a little bit different. But also people with celiac disease are more likely to develop underactive thyroid. So they're things that we check. So children and adults with type 1 diabetes do need to be checked every so often for celiac disease. And people who are diagnosed with underactive thyroid also need to be checked for celiac disease. So just listen to this question with hair falling out. Before I would go down the route of a supplement, I would definitely have a look with your GP and see, is the thyroid still working the way that it should, or do you need to be on some medication for that? If it's not underactive thyroid, some of the nutrients to look at for hair, a key one is protein. Hair is 99% protein. So if you're not eating enough protein, it's one of the places that you will see hair getting thin, and maybe some hair loss with that. From a nutrition point of view, your hair, your nails, your skin, they're kind of the last part of the body to get nutrition. So when you eat, things like your heart, your brain, your liver, they're going to get the nutrition first, and then whatever's left over will come into hair and nails. So your protein is important, and that you're getting maybe a little bit of protein at every meal. It's not about eating huge amounts. What's useful is to have a little bit in every so often. And then other nutrients that are brilliant for hair would be things like zinc is going to be important, copper is important, and great foods actually to eat for those would be nuts and seeds, because they're very rich in the minerals that are good for hair. So we mentioned seeds earlier in terms of fiber for digestion, but they're actually brilliant foods to add in if your hair isn't kind of what you'd like it to be. And fish is another brilliant food because it's rich in B vitamins, and particularly oily fish and shellfish are a really good source of lots of different minerals, so they're worth adding in as well. Definitely back to the GP for that one. Now, how are we looking? Yeah, just another question about getting a biopsy. Nobody really wants to go and have a biopsy done, and I can't say I blame them, especially for children. One thing that we do know is that the blood test, the screening test that we use for celiac disease, it's not going to be accurate in children under 3. So if you do have a young child who has a lot of the symptoms for celiac disease, then what we will find is that they may need to have a biopsy. They definitely need to be referred to their gastroenterologist to have that checked out. In terms of biopsy, it is really, really important to get it done. And we do see lots of people who would have only had the blood test. So it's actually very important to do it. It's a relatively quick test that you can have done. And as I said, you do need to get a biopsy taken from 4 different places in the gut. Now, it's very quick. The people doing it are very, very skilled and know what they're doing. But really, the blood test on its own isn't going to diagnose celiac disease in adults. In some children it might, but most actually will need just to have the check. And it's worth it because not everybody who has the high blood test is actually celiac. So they do need to check and make sure what's going on. And it's also useful to get a baseline because we do need to make sure the gut heals. And so if you have a repeat biopsy later on, it's worth just to check and see how the gut is healing and if it's going in the right direction with it. We have another question about sugars in gluten-free foods. We talked a little bit about that earlier. There can be a little more sugar in some gluten-free foods, but most are fine. And a lot of foods that are naturally gluten-free are not going to have sugar in them. So your naturally gluten-free foods are things like your meat, your chicken, your fish, nuts. There are eggs and nuts and seeds are all foods that would be naturally gluten-free. Milk, plain yogurt, plain milk, plain cheese. You do need to check the food list once flavorings start to be added to a lot of things, but most foods like your milk, they're all going to be gluten-free. Fats and oils that we would use in cooking, things like olive oil, will naturally be gluten-free. So we have lots of foods that are naturally gluten-free and are still really healthy. All your fruit and vegetables are naturally gluten-free. I think we've seen sort of a trend with some people who are avoiding gluten not because they're celiac or gluten intolerant, but just as was a bit of a sort of a trend there a while ago. We've seen lots more sort of nice treat foods coming in that are gluten-free, but it's worth remembering that although they're gluten-free, they will still have the same impact on your health from sort of a weight or sugar point of view as, you know, foods that are biscuits or sweets or cakes that don't contain gluten. So unless you are celiac or gluten intolerant, you certainly don't need to be on a gluten-free diet. But it's still important when you're on a gluten-free diet to eat just as healthily as you would even if you weren't celiac. So that seems to be all of the questions that we have in today. Thank you to everybody who has come on and joined in and sent in comments and questions. We will be running another Facebook Live in 3 to 4 weeks. We will certainly email out and contact all of our members for it. So let us know, and thank you very much.